Game comparisons is never easy, especially when you verse together franchises that represent and appeal to gamers from both spectrums, and this gaming comparison is no different. As we dare to put together two iconic franchises that symbolize the golden age of real-time strategy. Both the Starcraft and Age of Empires franchise remain hugely successful and had quite the cultural impact. The games are loved by many and remain a staple for PC gaming, especially in a time where real-time strategy isn't the prominent genre it once was. Yet, StarCraft and Age of Empires 1 or 2 or both remain installed on so many of our PCs. It goes without saying that the games have dramatically evolved since 1998, but personality, balance and the systems in place have definitely helped both transcend generations. The competition between Microsoft and Blizzard was fierce during this time, and we feel the genre needs that again. Now, with this year drawing to a close, we wanted to take some time to reflect back, discuss and compare these two iconic RTS franchises. The battle lines are drawn and CyberCom has been assigned to join the debate to help put to rest the ultimate question: which RTS franchise reigns supreme? It's definitely no easy task, as I've spent hours playing both to remain an avid fan, but there can only be one. So kicking off this comparison, we'll be looking at a quick overview of each series, head into the gameplay, the units and factions, discuss the economy systems of each, before we then compare the general strategic elements. In closing, we'll then head to our polls, numbers, reviews and the legacy each left to ultimately get us to crown the overall winner. This is Starcraft versus Age of Empires. The traditional RTS puts the player in command of the group of units and tasks them typically with wiping out the enemy. In addition, the economic layer controls how quickly you can build units and often a tech tree, which allows you to position more powerful units as the battle goes on. At the start of the 1990s, real-time strategy games had just blinked into existence, with Dune 2 the building of a dynasty back in 1992, but this subgenre would find a form so powerful that today's games are merely more complex variations. The game featured all the elements of a modern RTS, such as resource gathering for units and buildings, unique playable factions and distinguished units, technology trees and fog of war, which definitely left a lasting impact in the video game industry. The genre was picking up with classic titles such as Warcraft, Orcs and Humans, and Warcraft 2 Tides of Darkness, Command & Conquer, and Command & Conquer Red Alert. The RTS genre finally broke away a bit from the fantasy and sci-fi back in 1997, which saw the release of two very different takes on the same basic idea, both in terms of production values and gameplay mechanics. The co-creator of Civilization, Bruce Shelley, took on the project and together with Ensemble Studios took real-time strategy back to the Stone Age in October of 1997 with a much hyped hit, Age of Empires. The game was a commercial success which sold over 3 million copies. The original Age of Empires focused on ancient history, the Greeks, Egyptian, all the new kingdoms, the Phoenicians and Persians. As a ruler of the 12 distinct real historical civilizations, you were tasked with guiding your empire through the 4 ages while warring against as many as 7 rival empires for supremacy in the region. Just like in Civilization, you could build monuments called wonders to gain bonuses. Automatic victory in standard games if it's still standing after 2,000 years, or otherwise just a bonus score. And also, just like in Civilization, you really needed to keep pushing the research side to get to the next technological advancements before anybody else. In most other regards, it was an evolution on Red Alert and Warcraft 2. You now had 4 resources rather than 2 or 3: wood, gold, stone and food, which could be farmed, gathered from plants or caught by hunters. You also had more complex dependency systems for upgrades and buildings. Yes, the RTS genre was heating up and the team at Ensemble Studios was already hard at work for the sequel, Age of Empires 2 Age of Kings, which they intended to complete within a year by using code from the original. But several months into the process, they realized that they needed more time. They didn't want to compromise the quality. The team informed Microsoft that they needed another year and instead created Age of Empires: The Rise of Rome, a basic expansion to the first Age of Empires game. The expansion, The Rise of Rome, sold an additional 1.2 million copies and offered additional tweaks such as unit queuing, increasing the population beyond 50 in multiplayer games, and the ability to double-click and highlight the same unit type. The following year in 1999, the team finally released the highly anticipated Age of Empires 2 Age of Kings, which was focused on the medieval era and early Renaissance, where you could take control of one of 13 civilizations, including the Chinese, Goths, Britons, Vikings, among others. You start with a handful of villagers, and through expansion and careful handling of the economy, can advance up to a point where powerful war machines and well-trained masses of troops will be yours to take control. Age of Kings was a smash hit and saw an expansion, Age of Conquerors, about a year later, bringing more campaigns, civilizations, and some additional fixes. Age of Empires 3 could place focus on the colonial era and would release in 2005. It was critically well received due to the new direction and technical features, such as the inclusion of Havoc physics, simulation, and graphical features of the game. In Age of Empires 3, you could work to establish an empire and take on the role of the European power struggling to explore, colonize, and conquer North and South America. The game would release 2 additional expansions: the War Chiefs, which was centered around the warfare between the Americas and the native civilizations, while Age of Empires 3, the Asian dynasties, had you set to rule powerful and exotic Japanese, Chinese, and Indian civilizations of the East. The series was hugely successful and sold over 20 million copies worldwide, with much acclaim from fans and critics alike. And the story of Starcraft, well, that started way back in 1996 E3, where it was negatively compared to Warcraft 2. As a result, the project was entirely overhauled and then showcased in public in early of 1997, receiving a far more positive response. The military science fiction real-time strategy game was developed and published by Blizzard Entertainment and released for Microsoft Windows on March 31st, 1998. And based on the universal acclaim, sparked a franchise that revolutionized the genre by greatly differentiating the 3 different factions: Human, Zerg, and Protoss, with unique units and strategies. It was the single best-selling game of the year, maintained by Blizzard's just-launched Battle.net service that allowed people to play against each other all over the world. Starcraft was also a key title in the burgeoning esports industry in Asia and still remains insanely popular. The Starcraft franchise would go on to produce an expansion, Broad War, a highly successful sequel, and 2 expansions. Now the story begins with the Terrans, a band of humans who have colonized deep space. You play as a magistrate for the Confederacy of Man, but you quickly join up with a rebel group, the Sons of Coral, after the Allies leave your colonists to die. The Terran campaign is taken up by a pretty straightforward story in which you fight the Confederates and the Zerg, a race of violent parasitic aliens who seem to have no purpose but to consume and destroy. The story introduces you to the heroic frontier sheriff in the form of Jim Raynor, and a morally complicated heroine, the psychic special operative Sarah Kerrigan. The first tale ends in betrayal. The Sons of Coral abandon your people to the Zerg, and Sarah Kerrigan is devoured. And then the Zerg campaign begins, and things get interesting. The Zerg are much smarter than they initially appear, but the sentiment intelligence serving the Zerg are cruel and petty, bound together by the shared hunger for conquest and blood. The goal of the Zerg campaign are more primal than the Terran one. And you destroy your enemies and consume their territory, waging a nasty war between both humans and the Protoss, a warrior race that has traveled across the galaxy to crush the Zerg infestation. Starcraft 2 Wings of Liberty released in July 27, 2010, where you adapt the role of Jim Raynor, a former Marine, now turned outlaw turned rebel, I guess. Broadly linear interactive narrative with some multi-linear elements, which follows Raynor's attempt to increase the rebellion against the Terran Dominion, the now repressive dictatorship. The story continues in a many-sided war between the Zerg, Protoss, and the humans, and Raynor, which allies himself with the Foundation, which turns out to be the front for a faction within the Dominion, in an attempt to use the now reconstructed artifact to restore the humanity of the Queen of Blades, who Raynor loved. The story continues in the expansion StarCraft 2 Heart of the Swarm, where Kerrigan transforms back into a human at the end of Wings of Liberty, but decides to return to her role as leader of the Zerg after Raynor's apparent death and rages bloody revenge on Arcturus mechs. The tortured romance between the rebel leader and the Hive Mistress features predominantly. In the second expansion, Legacy of the Void, the Protoss campaign focuses on Artemis as he leads his people in the war against Ammon, which also marks the conclusion to the StarCraft saga. The Age of Empires series is based on historical events and requires you to develop a civilization by gathering 4 resources, namely food, stone, gold, and wood. To help assure victory against the enemy, you must gather these resources in order to pay for the new buildings, units, and more advanced technology. The resources in Age of Empires are more decentralized, which makes finding and defending gold and stone mines more difficult compared to just grabbing a new base as you do in StarCraft. Resource management as a result is more complex, which requires more strategic thinking. With Starcraft, each of the three races relies on only two resources to sustain the game, namely minerals and Vespene gas. Minerals are needed for all units and structures, and you require Vespene gas to create advanced units and buildings. Starcraft thus remains more fast-paced and aggressive in comparison, which helps spark the online competitive aspect, which the series would be well known for. Age of Empires does play slower, but generally makes the battle last longer than in Starcraft. The scale is also different, with big maps and more units. One key component for us in Age of Empires was the advancement through the different ages, which brought with it its new technologies, weapons, and matched the historical art style. Starcraft offered something similar, but it just felt more complete in Age of Empires. The initial game offered 4 single-player campaigns, which was a collection of scenarios which had to be completed in a linear fashion. The game also had game modes such as random map, a great online and network play capability with up to 8 people, together with a very popular scenario builder, which was an easy-to-learn map editor. The expansion Rise of Rome pretty much built on this and provided 4 new civilizations. Age of Empires 2, Age of Kings offered 5 campaigns and contained historical-based scenarios, 13 civilizations, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, an increased population limit of between 25 to up to 200, new detailed visuals. The game also had an extra game mode where you could obtain victory through military conquests by constructing a special building known as a wonder and keeping it standing for a certain amount of time. Deathmatch was exactly that. The mode would be fast-paced and would allow you to start in a large number of resources to focus more on the military aspect. The strategic element of this game is very deep, as there are upwards of 20 civilizations, taking the Conqueror's expansion into account. The factions weren't as wildly different as they were in Starcraft, but they were different enough so it had a noticeable impact on gameplay. There are also lots of matchups to learn. The Conquerors also introduced new game modes such as King of the Hill and Wonder Race, new and additional maps, which was based on real-life geographical locations, and new seasonal terrain textures. Age of Empires 3 uses a political system to grant bonuses on a successful advancement to another age, and allows you to play up to 8 different civilizations playable through the campaign. It also stepped up its visuals and detail. The single-player campaign in Starcraft offered 30 missions, split into 10 for each race, and touched on all the elements, which in addition offered an intriguing story. I personally enjoyed the campaign more than Age of Empires, as it featured AI that scaled in difficulty, even though you couldn't change the difficulty in single-player campaigns. Each campaign started with enemy factions running on easy AI modes, scaling through the course of the campaign to the hardest AI modes, which worked well. We also loved the cinematics and the musical score, which just set the mood perfectly. Multiplayer on Starcraft is driven through Blizzard Entertainment's Battle.net internet service, which up to 8 players can compete in a variety of game modes. The level editor was another mode called Star Edit for Starcraft and Broad War, whereby you could use map settings for single-player missions which were less structured. Starcraft 2 Wings of Liberty places you in a missionary-style campaign with its non-linear approach, with the main protagonist taking on jobs to buy units and upgrades. Wings of Liberty has 29 campaign missions, but only 26 of them are playable in a single playthrough, since 3 missions are choice-related alternatives. Blizzard also in addition worked on and improved the game's AI build orders and behaviors, which was already consistently exceeding Age of Empires 1 and 2 at this point. The second release, Heart of the Swarm, is Zerg-focused and has role-playing elements, which we loved. Kerrigan is the focus of the campaign and centers around her redemption. The Protoss-themed Legacy of the Void is the final expansion and adds new units both to single and multiplayer, with the Protoss Artenis attempting to reunite the Protoss tribes in order to stop Aemon. Each race in Starcraft has its own macro mechanic, which adds a lot of extra skill in the game. Being able to inject larvae or chrono boosts extra colossi while in a heated battle separates the good players from the weak ones. But Starcraft is far less customizable than Age of Empires ever was. It gives you far less choice. You pretty much always had to play by the standard settings in Starcraft 2, while over-socialization often restricted the options effectively available for those who played Age of Empires. I remember some LAN events where we'd enjoy playing around with those settings, which made the game really fun and interesting. We felt Starcraft overall offered a better single-player campaign in comparison to Age of Empires, together with a way better and most importantly consistent AI system. The 3 diverse races created a unique experience, with the Terrans showcasing strong defensive abilities, good harassment and versatility, whereas the Zerg on the other hand could switch army composition easily, had excellent map control and larva mechanics, which allowed Zergs to power out a strong economy faster than any other race. The Protoss offered a resilient army, fast upgrades, and was the most powerful in late game. I mean, every race performs differently and requires a different tactic, which is still widely credited in the RTS genre. The game generally focuses on high actions per minute and tactics, and most strategy remains bland, as it's either death balls, fast-paced tower pushing, or a RAS that remains the dominant. Age of Empires offered many different civilizations, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, with a key attention to history, even though we prefer sci-fi over historical events and such. But while the game seems simple in a sense that every civilization has the same basic units, damage, armor systems is incredibly complex. There are different types of armor. Melee armor applies when a melee unit attacks, and pierce armor applies when a ranged unit attacks you. There are lots of unit classes that have attack bonuses against other unit classes. Learning how those interact is one of the true complexities and challenges of the game, together with a real-time element of Age of Empires 2. The damage amounts is also different. For example, archers takes forever to destroy a building, while siege weapons do it in no time. This gives a completely different feel from Starcraft, where the amount of damage is much more similar for all units. Each game is a taxing exercise in strategic thinking, micromanagement, and high-stress multitasking. Age of Empires also offered more diverse and innovative game modes, which also added to the experience. It can be said that the basic principles of economy management is very similar in all four games. The player should collect and generate various kinds of resources to create structures, units, and purchase updated technologies. One of the first notable differences is that the resources are gathered in diverse ways that affects the gameplay. Starcraft and Age of Empires 2 require from the player to create multiple worker units and keep them constantly engaged into gathering resources along with their other tasks. Naturally, the more automated the gathering task is, the less micromanagement is required to perform it. Age of Empires requires the most micromanagement for this mentioned reason. As stated, the amount of resources also varies, which affects the strategic elements. Starcraft features minerals and Vespene gas, which also had to be managed and scouted for. But Age of Empires features 4 different resources: wood, food, gold, and stone, which challenge the strategic skill more as you need to keep track of more variables. But not only do you have to manage your economy and engage in warfare, you also have to constantly anticipate what your opponent is doing and figure out ways to counter it. In Age of Empires 2, the game features a game mode which assures victory by building a wonder which is strongly connected to the economy. We felt that Age of Empires as a series features a better economy system, especially in in-game trades with trade carts and marketplaces and 2 additional resource variables which kept you on your toes. The farms, fishing boats, hunting, gathering berries, all the different functions and resource gathering buildings. Everything just cleverly worked well and added to that extra depth of strategy into gathering resources. Age of Empires might add that layer of strategy with the additional resource variables, but the 3 races in Starcraft offered completely different build trees and advantages, which has a largely cascading effect on early decisions in the game. Starcraft also had much more micro potential than Age of Empires. Yes, Age of Empires had more buildings which offered that level of variety, where for example in Starcraft you'd have 3 military buildings: a barracks, factory, and starport. While in Age of Empires 2 you had 7: a barracks, archery range, stable, siege workshop, castle, monastery, and harbor. It makes sense as you would want to build at least 1 building of each type in mid-game to have all the options available. But many of those buildings will stand still and not produce units. Therefore, 1 or 2 buildings of the same type are usually enough to quickly produce an army, without the need, like you would do it in Starcraft, to create 3 or 4 barracks or something alike for parallel training. Your bases are big enough already, and I'm glad that you don't have to spam so many production buildings of the same type. That being said, when you play a game with a high population limit like 200, it can of course be necessary to build a lot of production buildings because your armies will be huge. The only buildings that should always be training units are of course the town centers, producing villages. The core eco is similar to Starcraft. Killed workers throw you back and are difficult to compensate. The basic macro follows the classic RTS formula. In Starcraft there are many units with sort of superpowers like Stalkers, which can teleport, and Infestors, which can take control of enemy units. Age of Empires has the Monks, which can convert enemy units and buildings, but Starcraft has another level of variety. The air units definitely add a strategic element, not present in Age of Empires, which may or may not be able to attack ground units, but you have more options within a race to create a unique army or air force combination. Another thing is that every unit has its use. Even the earlier units are useful until the end of the game. Also, each unit has a counter, so if you can scout your opponent and see what units they are making, you can create units to destroy those easily. This makes scouting more important in Starcraft than most games, and finding and killing enemy spies such as observers or changelings is very important. Continually gathering intelligence on the enemy and making sure that they can't do the same is difficult yet necessary to be the stronger player. I've even seen some pros fake out the opponent, making them build units to counter a specific build when in fact the player did something completely different. Then of course there are completely different yet well balanced races. I haven't seen another RTS that pulls this off as well as Starcraft 2. In Age of Empires 2, all the civilizations were pretty well balanced together with key micro differences, except for the Mayans versus Goths and Aztecs and water maps. But since strategic depth is up for the argument, something of an opinion, I'm going to have to give it to Age of Empires. I think the long-term planning inherent in Age of Empires is far more complex than Starcraft. Starcraft is all about the action and a few simple mistakes which would make you very dead. Now to look at some polls, numbers and reviews. We're looking at a few polls and the opinions were strongly pointing towards Age of Empires as being the favorite. Now in terms of comparing these two franchises, we'd be looking at critical and commercial reception in the form of Metacritic scoring and Wikipedia's best-selling PC games list to gauge on the sales data for the main series. The numbers are as follows. With Age of Empires, the highest critical score in the series is still with Age of Empires 2, Age of Kings for the PC at a solid 92 out of 100. And the highest total shipped units sitting firmly with the first Age of Empires at 3 million. It's also the best-selling installment in the series. As an entirety, the series has sold over 28 million units. With the Starcraft series, the highest critical score is firmly sitting with Starcraft 2, Wings of Liberty for the PC at a claimed 93 out of 100. And the highest total copies sold, well, this was the first Starcraft, which sold over 11 million copies. It's also the best-selling installment of the series and the 7th best-selling PC game ever. As an entirety, the series has sold over 17 million units. Starcraft's smart storytelling paired with its rich premise in setting a 21st century fight for domination between the exiled from Earth Terrans, the insectoid Zerg and the high-tech Protoss, all playing out in the distant Corpulus sector of the Milky Way galaxy, represented one major way in which the game improved upon Blizzard's earlier efforts. The game truly revolutionized the genre and offered not only incredible in-game atmosphere, but 3 diverse races which looked and most importantly played completely different. Starcraft's Brood Wars was one of the foundational games in the rise of esports to prominence, and the sequel continues to attract television audiences, huge prize pools and high-level professional players. It's taken Blizzard 12 years to produce a sequel to the first Starcraft, and during that decade since its release, it has remained a phenomenon. Not only has it spawned the usual merchandising production line that most Blizzard games create, like novels, keychains, t-shirts, statues, but it also sold over 10 million copies, grabbed a couple of Guinness World Records, and it played as a television sport in South Korea. Yet the game was remastered together with its expansion Brood Wars, which featured updated visuals while leaving the gameplay unchanged. Starcraft 2 is the platonic ideal of the micro-heavy multiplayer RTS game. Watching experts players at work is bewildering as the clicks per minute rise and the whole game falls into strange and sometimes unreadable patterns. According to the Starcraft wiki, a proficient player can perform approximately 150 productive actions per minute. Starcraft 2 remains highly regarded because it's perfected an artwork that only a dedicated few can truly appreciate. Its campaigns contains a bold variety of missions with decent storytelling. Age of Empires mixed the frantic clicking of Warcraft with the technological advancements of Civilization, combining them into an RTS that was bigger, bolder and smarter than most of its late 90s competition. The series became a massive commercial and critical success and revitalized the genre. I remember the hype the game created, and for the time it offered incredible strategic gameplay and most importantly allowed you to take your time and plan your attack. The game is at its best when it gives you plenty to do without overwhelming, letting you build and protect cities rather than simply just sending soldiers off to war. A remastered version of the game was also released on 20th Feb 2018 via the Windows Store, which featured 4K graphics and an upgraded soundtrack. Many RTS players, however, still consider Age of Empires 2 to be a classic, but many people's judgment is simply a better game than Age of Empires 3, and its expansions also didn't really hit the mark due to the weaker metagame, which also included many changes to the multiplayer that old Age of Empires 2 players, including us, did not like. The specific role of the units was also hard to tell at a glance, well, most times. with the exception of melee units. Age of Empires 2 was a wonderful base game, and its expansions were also very good, which maintained an active fan community. They did not all swap over to Age of Empires 3, and remember the anticipation when Age of Empires 2 HD Edition was announced. It finally released in April 2013 on Steam. The definitive edition would eventually go on to release on November 14th, 2019 for the Xbox Game Pass, Steam, and the Windows Store. It also included all the previous expansions from the original. The better RTS game? Well, it's ultimately down to preference and what appeals to you personally. We love and respect both series, and I grew up playing both, but there can only be one. And for this comparison, we had to go with Age of Empires. Now, the strategic elements, economy, units and factions, the many different civilizations, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, definitely added a layer of strategy that Starcraft, in our opinion, lacked. Yes, it had air units, but in terms of variety, Age of Empires makes up for this. The game had historical relevance, more customizations, bigger maps and population limits, which made for a more impactful real-time experience. At the Xbox annual global celebration, the first gameplay trailer for Age of Empires 4 was revealed, and it takes place during the battle in the Middle Ages, which is the same period which featured in Age of Empires 2, but which, based on reports, would be set a bit earlier, scraping up against the early Renaissance. The Age of Empires 2 vibe is great, but for the RTS genre, this announcement is even better. Hey, thank you so much for watching this CyberCom Gaming Comparison featuring Starcraft versus Age of Empires. We know these franchises means a lot to a lot of people, and again, this was just from our perspective. But we're always keen to hear from you guys though, so let us know in the comments below and what your thoughts are. If you've liked this video, then please consider liking this video. And if not already subscribed, then please consider subscribing for future uploads. CyberCom just wanted to say thank you for all the support, feedback, everyone that's following us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, thank you so much. You guys must have an awesome week. See you soon. See ya.